All right, welcome back to another edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. We bring you today's labor news, history, and analysis from the U.S. and around the world. This is a podcast you listen to with your fellow workers organizing on the shop floor. This is a podcast you listen to before walking into your union meeting. As always, I'm Rico Rutia, here with my co-host, Brian Pfeiffer. Tonight we have a special edition of We Rise Fighting. We are once again interviewing David Van Deusen, now the former president of the Vermont AFL-CIO. Now, if listeners remember, we interviewed him in November of 2022. It was episode number 18, and he shared some very inspiring labor and anti-fascist struggles coming out of Vermont, so we're very pleased to chat with him again. This time around, we're going to be chatting about his new book titled Insurgent Labor, the Vermont AFL-CIO from 2017 to 2023. The book is available on pmpress.org. If you search under that very name, you can also look it up under David's name, which is David Van Deusen, D-A-V-I-D, space V-A-N, space D-E-U-S-E-N. And for this show, as always, we love to kick things off with some music. And honestly, a little while back, Brian introduced me and perhaps some of you to the song Bella Ciao, the Italian anti-fascist anthem. And today I wanted to hear a ska version of it, so I looked it up on YouTube and conjured up a version by the Scatterlocks. Now, I am not mad at this version, and I am not mad at anyone looking to cover Bella Ciao. Maybe you're not in the front lines of these protests today, and you have to stay confined to your workplace for survival. Still, you can speak truth to power at staff meetings, anti-oppression trainings, at spiritual convergences, at community meetings, and of course at union meetings. You can speak out against fascism, white supremacy, state repression, and all of that. And Bella Ciao is here as evidence. Broadcast it nice and loud. Here's Bella Ciao as covered by the Scatterlocks.
One fine morning, I woke up early. Oh, Bella Ciao, Bella Ciao, Bella Ciao. One fine morning, I woke up early. Find a fascist at my door. Oh, partigiano, please take me with you. Oh, Bella Ciao, Bella Ciao, Bella Ciao, Ciao, Ciao. Oh, partigiano, please take me with you. I'm not afraid anymore. Yeah! Partigiano, oh Bella Ciao, Bella Ciao, Bella Ciao, Ciao, Ciao. Bury me up on the mountain beneath the shadow of the flower. Show all the people passing. Oh Bella Ciao, Bella Ciao, Bella Ciao, Ciao, Ciao. Show all the people passing, and say, oh, what a beautiful flower. This is the flower of the partisan. Oh, Bella Ciao, Bella Ciao, Bella Ciao. This is the flower of the partisan who died for freedom. Ciao! Ciao, 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 ciao. This is the flower of the partisan who died for freedom. This is the flower of the partisan who died for freedom.
All right, what's up? And welcome back, listeners. Today is a special edition of We Rise Fighting Labor podcast. We have David Van Deusen from the Vermont AFL-CIO back on the show, talking about a new book that he wrote. David, right off the bat, what can you tell us about the book, your biggest takeaways, the biggest lessons? What the first thing that comes to mind? What What's up? And
Well,
congratulations,
look,
first of all.
thank you. I appreciate it. The new book is called Insurgent Labor, the Vermont AFL-CIO 2017 to 2023. It was important to craft this work because, as some of your listeners may know, I expect they do, the Vermont AFL-CIO has seen a resurgency in labor militancy over the last few years. We went from nearly dead in 2017, 2018 to our progressive working class left slate called United, sweeping 4 elections in a row, taking the reins of the Vermont AFL-CIO and radically changing the way we do business in this state. We took money out of lobbying and put it into organizing department where we could deploy real organizers, real resources to our affiliates across the state to organize new shops or to internally organize the shops they already have. That's a big change. We more than doubled the amount of delegates, building union democracy within the labor movement, more than doubling the delegates afforded to affiliates to attend our conventions. We have fought like hell to build a strong, powerful, assertive labor movement, one that is not afraid of strikes, one that knows our mission needs to be to grow, and one which is not afraid to do the right thing even when it's hard politically, and to act upon the values and the principles of a working class left. If you look at how other AFL-CIO state affiliates operate, state labor councils, you will take note that we are doing things different. Where other state labor councils have hitched their wagon to the Democratic Party, we've been unafraid to reject both capitalist parties, the Republicans and Democrats, and frankly, align ourselves with the Vermont Progressive Party in a very real way, which is a Democratic Socialist Party, which wins elections in Vermont. So we're doing things different, and we're growing. Unlike most labor councils in the United States, we are consistently growing. We are now in a growth period. We had 10,000 AFL-CIO members in our state in 2019 when we first took power, and we have 20,000 members in our state today. And if you look, the trajectory since the 1950s, since labor forgot its militant roots, since labor forgot to be assertive and started to fear the strike and putting more value in political parties that frankly do not have our back when it matters, our numbers have shrunk from a high point nationally of 35% in the 1950s to about 10% today. We're beating that in Vermont, and we could beat that in the rest of the country, and we could turn things around, but we need to do things different. We need to be militant, and we need to build an independent working class power base, one that is free from the major political parties.
And David, in reading a little bit of your book today, I did come across one word that did pop out to me, and it always pops out to me. It's experimentation. I love experimentation in labor, political struggle, in music. If you could share some of the experimentation that you've undergone, that you've messed with, like what were some of the biggest lessons? How are they applied? Stuff like that.
Well, let me take a step back here. Like, I know this, that if you consistently do the same thing and it fails every single time, time in, time out, that is insanity to keep repeating those actions and expect a different outcome. That's what organized labor in the United States has been largely doing since the 1950s. The same thing time in, time out. We put an emphasis on the inside game. We put an emphasis on lobbying. We put an emphasis on putting millions of dollars into elections for candidates for the lesser of two evils, instead of putting those lion's shares of resources into organizing and building our base. And what has that done? It has got very little legislation passed that actually benefits unions, let alone the broader working class. It has put political parties into power time and time again, which do nothing for us once they get into power. If you want to look at the Biden administration, look no further than what they did to the railroad workers last year when they took their legal right to strike away for this contract strike and stuck them with a shitty contract, mandated it, the federal government did, with the support of both the Democratic and Republican parties with very few dissenters, and made them go to work without paid sick days, right? So this is the fruits of our labor that we have got. And meanwhile, people are surprised or shocked that our union density is decreasing. They can't understand why none of our bills passed. They can't understand why we went from 35% union density to 10%, and we're going down in many corners of this country, right? So when I think about experimentation, this is what I'm talking about. Let's not do those things that fail over and over again. Let's do something different, okay? And we don't have to always recreate the wheel. You could look around the world and see where workers are willing to throw down their tools and use their power and say no more. They start to win. And here in the United States, when we democratize our labor movement, when we say we want to know rank and file what you believe, what your priorities are, we want to work together towards a different kind of society, because frankly, we're the 99%. We are the one with the power if we choose to use it, if we choose to be united. And if we could dream up a new way of doing business, if we could think of new priorities, if we could think of a different politics, we can achieve it if we have the active base to carry it out. And we're not going to have the active base to carry it out unless we give them power, unless we decentralize the reins of control within the labor movement and build a truly democratic labor movement. And in Vermont, that's exactly what we've been doing. We've been trying to decentralize. We've been trying to build power. We've started worker circles in different parts of the state, 4 different parts of the state, where not only union members, but non-union, currently non-union, working class people come together to talk about their struggles, not just in their work sites, but also in the community and how we could do things different. And we've seen our numbers and our power grow as a result of this. This is why I wrote the book. I wanted to talk about the challenges. I wanted to talk about our victories. I want to talk about the new model that we can take, not just here, but everywhere, versions of it, aspects of it, and apply it to the real life struggles we're engaged in today. But I also wanted to talk about some things that didn't work, right? Because this isn't all rainbows and fantasy. We're talking about real life. And frankly, if we're going to experiment, some things are going to work, some aren't. But the nature of that experimentation is finding out which things are effective, which things do build power, and try to put the focus on them. And if we try something and it doesn't work, that's fine. Then let's move on. But we know what's not fine is doing the same thing labor's been doing for 50 years and expecting a different result. We have to change. And some of our national leaders know this. Let's look at the greatly successful strikes we've seen lately with the UAW, right? With a stand-up strike under a reform candidate, Sean Fain. Let's look at the practice pickets that were done at UPS with the reform candidate, Sean O'Brien, now president of that union, International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Let's look at the great work being done by Sarah Nelson, president of the flight attendants. She's been doing an awesome job standing up and fighting for the working class and for our union members. Let's look at the bold political action being taken by APWU under their reform candidate, their reform president, Mr. Dimenstein. I mean, they were one of the first unions in the country to step out and say, you know what, ethnic cleansing and civilians being slaughtered in Palestine is not okay. You know, and Mark was one of the first ones to do that. So there are great pockets of progressive, left-wing working class growth in various large unions in the United States. The trick for us now is to take the work being done by these newly progressive union internationals, take the good work being done by Central Labor Councils, a number of good ones all throughout the country, the Vermont AFL-CIO, and now we have to start to conceptualize how we make that into a unified movement, a national caucus, a national slate capable of carrying out real fundamental change within the labor movement. That's what we need to do, not just to survive, but to win, because the name of the game is winning. And at the end of the day, we're not doing this just for fun. We're not doing this just to pass the time. We're doing this to win a society where the economy actually works for working people, and where working people have the democratic power to change society into the type of world that they would prefer and deserve to live in.
So, David, a couple practical questions that we took a look at your book, and we've also interviewed you previously. And some of the practical things that y'all did and are doing in the Vermont AFL-CIO are taking money out of lobbying budget items and putting that into organizing. And also some very practical organizing activities that has, you argue in your book, that has led to your success that you just described. Can you explain some of that?
Well, look, it's one thing to have some grandiose ideas and some good principles, and we have a very good platform with our 10-point program, our little green book. But that's not good enough. You have to learn how to implement them. There needs to be praxis involved, right? You actually have to try to go beyond words and implement these changes in a real life way. And while you're doing that, if you're going to be asking your members, the rank and file, to walk with you on this path, you need to be able to deliver for the rank and file as well. During United's, we're in our 5th year of power now. I'm no longer president, but United won the last election under the new United backed president, Katie Maurice and Ellen Kay as executive vice president, both from United. We have a majority still on our executive board. But one of the things we prioritize in my first 2 terms as president is to work very closely with the building trades on some very practical bread and butter issues. We were helpful, and we worked with them in getting responsible contractor ordinances passed in 3 different cities throughout Vermont: Barrie, Montpelier, and our largest city, Burlington, which will mandate that all major construction public projects done with public money will, by law, have to pay prevailing wages to the construction workers, which gives fair footing for building trade unions to unionized contractors to bid on those projects and get that work. Because it's not just good enough we build nice things in a city. Our workers need to be able to afford to live in those cities where they're building those projects. That is very bread and butter kind of stuff. And we need to do that well. And when our UAW local here went on strike, support staff at a place called Goddard College, we did everything we possibly could to build public support for them and help them organize picket lines, help them organize a demonstration at the State House. And they won their strike, securing a new contract, which not only achieved the fair raises they needed to see, but after being out some weeks on strike, they also managed to secure a new contract that has no management rights in it, which, for those in the labor movement who know what those clauses tend to be in contracts, it is very remarkable not to have a management rights clause in the contract. But these, again, are very anchored bread and butter actions that labor councils need to do. You can't just do the big things. You can't just talk about and start planning for how we're going to, do we need to have a general strike to defend democracy, right? You have to do those things if a Trump type situation comes about, but you also have to do the bread and butter. People need to be able to pay their bills. People need to be able to stay in their homes. People need to have jobs, and you need to deliver on those things if you're going to have credibility to build for the larger things.
You know, one of the things that caught my attention was you had a section in your book talking about changing to win. And for me, change to win, that whole debate, that whole time period in labor history, I consider it now part of labor history, was very educational for me. A lot of stuff came out, you know, a lot of different ideas came out, a lot of different theories started to come out all of a sudden. And for the sake of our listeners, you know what that was change to win was around what, 2002 to 2003, 2004. There was a huge debate in the labor movement as to whether or not unions should create a new federation, and call it change to win. Something that took on a different strategy than the AFL has been taking, and kind of a new blood to that. And this led to a debate, and what I consider to be a healthy debate, a very useful educational debate. And so I was wondering, you know, what you took away from that debate, what that time period meant for you, what lessons you got from Change to Win, that whole little time period that took place.
Sure. Well, look, first I'd say that in Vermont, we're very fortunate that part of our state labor council, through something called solidarity charters, are all of the SEIU locals, organizations here in Vermont are affiliated with us, and they have backed us at our conventions, backed us meaning united in our elections. And SEIU continues to do very good organizing. We have our Starbucks workers, our Ben & Jerry's workers in the retail shop, the doctors at UVM Medical Center, custodians in Bennington College, and a number of other folks organized with SEIU, many of them newly organized. And that's great. And we love to have their solidarity. SEIU, going back to when the split happened, AFL-CIO, they believed, rightly so, that we need to put more focus on organizing. One of the things that I think they did not go far enough is they did not have any significant difference, in my view, with the AFL-CIO when it came to still doing tons and tons of work and priorities on elections and on lobbying. Now, my mind, those things, legislation and elections, come after. First, you build your power. First, you build your base. That's where the resources need to go when you have a shrinking or stagnant labor movement. And then later, down the road, we could turn towards those questions again. SEIU and the unions that went with Change to Win, I frankly don't think it was as radical of a break as somebody else may argue. I also have been loyal to the AFL-CIO, meaning this, throughout my working career and my career as a union person. the fact is the AFL-CIO is by far the largest labor organization in the United States of America. Changed to when essentially disintegrated. But even at their height, they were still a very small group compared to what remained in the AFL-CIO. Right now, we have about 12.5 million members in the AFL-CIO. We need to double that. We need to triple that. We need to quadruple that. But we're not going to see major change in society until and unless we galvanize the AFL-CIO to make it better than it is now. And I think that as a loyal AFL-CIO member, or more importantly, as a working class person that has a direct stake, a direct desire for radical change in society, democratic change, we need to make the AFL-CIO that vehicle for change. So when I talk about building a national coalition, this is something we need to be doing in the next 5 years, if not sooner. When we build a national coalition of working class left unions and union radicals, union activists who agree that we need a unified platform and we need to actually change the way we're doing things for the better, I believe that that work needs to happen within the AFL-CIO. And if we believe that we're democratic, then that should be okay, right? We should be able to have open debate within the labor movement. We should be able to disagree with each other at times. And if we change the playing field, if we make it so national officers are elected directly by the members, then I believe we could win. But the first fight, that's one of the first fights, is I do think we have to change the national AFL-CIO to have officers directly elected by members. Right now, it's done by delegates. So 500 delegates at a national convention will decide who the national leadership is in an organization of 12.5 million people. If it was a country of 12.5 million people and you told me our process, we elect our president by 500 officials deciding who the president is, I wouldn't say that's a democracy. Now, we inherit those archaic Byzantine bylaws from times long ago, but now we're not in those long ago times. And I think we have to walk the talk. And we have to change our bylaws, we have to change our constitution, and we have to fight in a large coalition of progressive forces to make those changes, to make us more democratic, not just at the Vermont AFL-CIO level, but also at the national AFL-CIO level.
So, David, the United Slate and the Vermont AFL-CIO program, in many ways, is rooted in what we here at We Rise Fighting called internationalism. And you talk a lot about that. We talked about that on our previous interview, and you have that in your new latest book. Can you explain what you mean by that and why, in your view, it's so necessary to have an outlook and organizing in terms of labor and unions and organizing an organized international perspective?
Well, the fact is that the corporations are international. The billionaire class, for all intents and purposes, is an international class. They coordinate their efforts worldwide to make the economies of various national countries suit their needs, which is to generate profit for private shareholders or for the owners of the corporations, the CEOs, et cetera, et cetera. What we can't do is we can't spend all of our energy unionizing new shops, say in the South, of auto workers, just to see those factories close up and move to super exploited markets in other places of the world that don't have the same labor rights, the same labor protections. So the UAW has a direct interest, self-interest, if you will, a collective or self-interest, in not only building a stronger labor movement here, but to lending solidarity and resources and to coordinate to help people form unions all across the globe. So when they get that good new contract, that contract doesn't end up with a factory being shut down and sent overseas. I'm happy that under Sean Fain's leadership and Democratic folks that are now in control of that international union, they have been sending resources to Mexico, and they've been working with Mexican unions to strengthen the auto unions down there. That is a good thing. But it goes beyond just the unions, right? If we're talking about like very core things, if in the United States, if a critical mass of us say, okay, we need to work on the economic front, we need to make sure if you work 40 hours a week, that you have a wage, a livable wage that allows you to live a good, dignified life. If we're going to fight domestically to say everybody has a right to health care, if we're going to fight domestically to say not only are we going to defend the vestiges of democracy we have, but we're going to fight to create more democracy in the workplace and frankly, more democracy in society where the people actually could rule. If we're going to do that here, we have to look overseas, and we have to look in other countries and see where people are fighting those same fights. It might be in a different context. It might be through different means, but where we see people engaged in the same struggles in its core, we need to reach our hand out, shake their hand, and be in solidarity with them. The first thing that comes to mind is if you look at Northeast Syria right now. I don't know if how much you're aware of what's been happening in the Kurdish regions of Syria, but in that area of the world called Rojava, they rose up. Working people and small farmers rose up with guns in their hands and drove out ISIS. And instead of saying, we're going to create a new dictatorship, we're going to do the same thing that you see over and over in the Middle East, they have been fighting with guns in hand to create a direct participatory democracy, which is secular, which involves the unions and the planning of the economy, and which is, frankly, the most far-reaching revolution I have seen in this world since perhaps the Paris Commune of 1871, which was very short-lived, or in areas of Spain during the Spanish Civil War. And there I'm talking about the CNT and FAI. And that's going on right now today in Syria, in Rojava. And they are now facing attacks, civilian attacks on infrastructure and on people from the authoritarian Turkish government using U.S. weapons, a NATO member state attacking civilian targets in Rojava because they're afraid that if they set the example of creating a direct participatory democracy in that corner of the Middle East, it will spread into Turkey, it will spread into parts of Iraq and Iran, and they are scared as hell of that. But that's the kind of movement we as working people, as labor unions, need to be supporting, and we need to start to coordinate our efforts worldwide if we're going to have a serious movement to create a more democratic world, and if we're going to have a serious movement to empower workers, not just here at home, which we need to, but also abroad.
Hey, your book also makes reference to Palestine and Cuba as far as international solidarity. What lessons do we have to learn from Cuba, Palestine? What international solidarity can we create? What's that all about? Can you give us a little glimpse there?
Well, look, I mean, right off the bat, it's the moral and political responsibilities of organized labor in the US and throughout the world to say when you see a people being ethnically cleansed and 30,000 plus civilians being murdered by another state, and I'm talking about Palestine here, it's our moral and political responsibility to stand up and say that's not acceptable. I am very happy that the National AFL-CIO has called for a ceasefire. Before that, the UAW was one of the leaders of calling for a ceasefire, as was APWU and many unions before and after. Working people are saying enough, right? We cannot support we cannot allow an American government to give arms to another country that is actively engaged in ethnic cleansing without resistance. And this is what we need to do. We need to organize resistance to this terrible travesty that's going on, this horror that's going on, because these are working people too. And just because right now today they're refugees, frankly, facing life and death situations, they are still working people. And it's not okay. It wouldn't be okay in Wisconsin. It wouldn't be okay in Vermont. It can't be okay in Palestine. So, I mean, on a moral level, we need to be involved. These are working folks, right? We need to be involved. And in Cuba, the blockade against the Cuban people that's been going on for generations is also absolutely unjustified and immoral. And it's time for that blockade to end. But we could talk about international issues all day long, and they are worthy to talk about, but we're not going to be able to change our country's fundamentally our country's foreign policy until we grow strong enough as a labor movement here to not only win domestic victories here for working people, but also to change, to make the politicians afraid of us. They will not do the right thing because it's right. They will do it because they fear us. And they're not going to fear us until we grow our power. And we're not going to grow our power until we, A, grow as an organization, as unions, organize shoe shops, bring millions of members in. And that means we have to put resources there, not in these lobbying efforts, in these elections, which do not bear fruit. We need to change the way we do things to grow our power. And further, we need to democratize our U.S. labor movement. We need to have the rank and file engaged, because you can't expect working folks, rank and file, to stand on the barricades with you when the time comes and it has to happen if they don't feel that they have a direct investment, a direct voice in the organization that is calling for these actions. So they need to feel that ownership, and they're going to feel that ownership because we're going to build more democracy within labor.
So, David, what do you see as we have listeners that are a wide range of listeners, some who have never organized before, some who are longtime organizers or leaders in the labor movement, and everything in between. What do you see as some of the best fundamentals? I'm talking day-to-day fundamentals in union organizing. For example, coming up with an organizing plan to either organize a new shop, it could be a pre-existing shop, reviving a local that might have been more bound. Just generally, what do you see as some of the practical best tips and techniques in organizing fundamentals in your work, and some of that's how's that been working in Vermont?
Well, I think one of the core day-to-day things that a state labor council, or for that matter, the national AFL-CIO needs to do is have high-quality, accessible trainings to give people the tools they need to organize on the shop floor, to build new unions. When United came to power, we not only hosted stewards trainings and workplace power trainings aimed at shops that are a union, we also organized a number of how to form a union trainings, specifically geared towards and given to for free workers that aren't in unions, to give them that 101 of what is a union, how do you go from wanting a union to achieving a union, right? What are the best ways to organize? So why do I say this? Because we need to give working people the tools they need to win. We can't just think that somehow magically it's going to change. We can't just think that tomorrow we're going to wave a magic wand and all of a sudden we're going to have our union density up by 20% and things are going to work out. But that means we have to go outside of our silos. I mean, part of the failure of the labor movement over the last 50 years is it became more insulated. It can't be insulated. We are an expression of the working class, and we need to be embedded with the working class. And that means we need to work to rise up not only those that are organized, but those who are not yet organized, and give them the tools to do it. So I don't see enough trainings going on like that, specifically geared to the unorganized. And when we gave those trainings, there was direct results from that. There was a number of union shops that are now have a union contract that directly came out of those trainings. So it's not theoretical, it's not virtue signaling. This is a very practical thing that a labor council could do. Frankly, if they have the will. And we have the will, and we have shown that we are one of the few states in the United States of America where our union membership has grown.
And David, going through your book a little bit, I noticed that chapter 5 was called From Opposition to Governing. And I can somewhat infer what that might be about. You know, on this show, we talk about building a new world from the shell of the old. I was wondering if it speaks to that, or if it's something along those lines. Either way, the title of that chapter caught my attention. Could you speak a little bit about that, as long as we have the author on the line here?
Sure. Now, like, look, what you got to understand, and this won't be a shock to anybody, is when you're running a campaign, especially when it's an insurgent campaign, and you're on the outside looking in, you know, that's the time to talk about how things need to be different. That's the time to talk about what that difference would look like, right? It's good to be aspirational in the sense that you need to energize folks to give them something to fight for. But when you get into power, look, I got to be honest with you, there's very difficult things you have to deal with. And there are limitations to what you can or should do at a given time. Like, I'll give you an example. After George Floyd was murdered, I'm sure you recall that period of time. There were uprisings going on all across the United States. There was large protests going on right here at home in Vermont. We felt very strongly that in that historic moment, we had to take a strong stand. We had to be proactive, and we had to use the force of labor for change. So we debated. We had 2 executive board meetings where we debated what the right course of action would be. We had some of our members, frankly, that some of the leadership within United that were pushing for an expulsion of all police, law enforcement within our state federation. Now, in Vermont, you have to keep in mind, we're talking about very few police are in the AFL-CIO. We're talking about a few dozen, right? So the reality of what an aspect of our leadership was calling for was the expulsion of a few dozen members, literally a few dozen. Most of our cops are in at the time were in independent unions or in a very right-wing union called the NEPBA, which backed Trump and all of us, right? Not part of the AFL-CIO. So for a few dozen members, there was a push. The reality was, if we would have gone that step, I think there could have been an implosion because there was a number of internationals and affiliated locals that weren't there. That is not where they were. And for us to contain or continue to govern, to continue to have the moral and the political authority and the backing to continue what we're doing, we felt, a majority of us felt that that would be a bridge too far. What we ultimately called for was a moratorium on organizing police units. And we also became the first state labor council in the United States of America that explicitly stated our support for Black self-determination. That has never been done by a major labor organization in the United States. And frankly, I think we set the standard very high and went much further than any other major union in the United States when it comes to this issue. But if you get too far out, why do I say all this? If you get too far out of the members, if you get too far out of the rank and file, no matter what the principle of the matter may be, then you lose. Then you risk losing the support that's behind you. And if you lose the support that's behind you, then you're no longer going to be in power. And if you're no longer in power, you're no longer going to be able to march towards those core changes that you need to see in society. So it gets complicated. Once you're actually ruling, once you're actually in power, and you're not just trying to attain power, there are difficult decisions that some folks are going to be uncomfortable with. Did we make the right decisions in that case? Did we make the right decisions all the time? Maybe not. I don't know. But there are very real pressures that come down to bear on you. And you need to risk, but you need to calculate what that risk is and what is the value of that risk, right? What's the cost benefit analysis of that risk? There's a lot of scenarios like that in the book. One of the other places where we took a risk that was very meaningful is we had a vote to authorize a general strike. The national AFL-CIO at the time under Richard Trumka threatened to unilaterally remove us from office, right? He threatened to put us under trusteeship and take us over and forcibly kick us out of power. At the time, we contemplated declaring, if he was to do that, government in exile and simply ignoring his dictate, right? But there was real economic factors involved there. We relied on a significant amount of funding from the national AFL-CIO as well. And in that moment, when we put it on the scale, we thought, if democracy is going to come in crisis in our country, if this is potentially the end of the vestiges of democracy we have, then what are we waiting for? What are we hoping to save? Is it a title next to your name that's recognized by some office in DC? Because you know what? I could live without that. Right. And in that case, we took the risk and we took steps to plan for the general strike, and we took concrete, real steps to do that should Trump not leave office in January 2021. I'm glad that he did. I'm glad that we didn't have to carry out that general strike, but we took that very seriously. And that was something we were really ready to risk everything on.
So, David, following up to that, you mentioned in your book that we, as the working class, cannot rely on the state to protect us. And you give many different examples of that. A couple are, I believe you have an anti-fascist motorcycle brigade. And if I remember correctly, that's part of the resolution to form those types of formations within organized labor. And you also talk about how we need to be nuanced. And again, as you said just recently here, that we need to go out and talk to workers and find out what's what. So in your book, you talk about talking and going out and understanding that the National Guard is largely from the working class, and doing investigation and research and being careful of assumptions when we start forming, if necessary, these types of formations in an anti-fascist way. And just lastly, that this is not over. It looks like Trump's going to be running again. And the ideas that were brought up, I think Rick and I see the same way on this, that it's possible that Trump could potentially either be president again or attempt another coup. So the things that have been raised are very relevant, still relevant, even from when you raised all of that a couple of years ago. So I know that was a bit much there, but do you have any response to that? And could you expand on it?
Yeah, well, the genie's out of the bottle. Our democracy is precarious, and it's going to remain precarious. It is open to another coup attempt. And what we saw on January 6th and the events that took place before that and after that, that was the beginnings of a coup threat. That was very serious. That was real. We were one or two bad generals away from shooting taking place in the streets in Washington, D.C. And God knows what it came to that. I know what we would have done in Vermont. We would have organized a general strike, and we would have expected that general strike to spread to other states. General strike is a powerful tool, but it's also very clear that there is a rising right wing in this country which is violent, and we would be foolish to simply rely on the state for protection to that, especially if we don't know whose hands the state is going to be in come a year from now, right? We need to be able to rely on ourselves. Working class people have been defending themselves through their unions, through their organizations, through their solidarity for generations, and that's a long tradition, and we can't shy away from that. We did charter a motorcycle club who's been great in providing our security as sergeant at arms to our events and also at demonstrations that we have. And whenever we feel it's necessary, whenever the president and the folks in office feel that we need that presence there. So there are potentially dark times ahead. The number one thing we could do to be ready for those dark times, to resist those dark times, is to organize internally and to grow externally. And as I said to start this interview, to democratically empower members so they feel vested in the labor organizations that they're part of. So when it comes time to fight, when it comes time to push back, when it comes time to meet force with force, we're going to have members there and they're going to be with us. We can't get too far out ahead. But we need to defend democracy. We need to defend ourselves. We need to be able to defend our communities. Now, the rise of fascism in this country is a threat to democracy. It's also a threat to organized labor. The first thing the fascists did in Nazi Germany is they outlawed and jailed labor leaders. So let's not pretend that if there was a far right coup in the United States or the far right came into power again, don't think that we're not going to be under attack. Under the first Trump term, that's when a politically appointed Supreme Court outlawed union dues, mandatory union dues in the public sector. There were attacks left and right, up and down against organized labor from the Trump administration and people he appointed. That will continue again once the right comes into power. And when the Democrats are in power, because they do not fear us yet either, they have failed to pass the PRO Act. They have failed to advance a working class union agenda in any meaningful way that changes the bounds. And so we need to rely on ourselves. And when I talk about power and fear, again, FDR didn't magically make the New Deal happen. There were millions of workers in the street saying enough is enough. There were strikes all over this country. And the alternative to the New Deal was a very real threat of revolution. And we need to get back to that kind of militancy, because that's where we're going to see political changes take place that empower unions and empower working class people to help us have the tools we need to move to a more democratic, more pro-labor society.
Okay, and David, this is more of a personal question. Like, what were your takeaways after writing this book? Like, what life lessons did it leave on you? That could be political, that could be personal, that could be anything. But like, looking back right now, what do you think in 10 years you'll look back and be like, damn, I learned this from writing this book?
Well, I don't know that I learned anything on a personal level from the act of writing the book itself. What the book depicts is one small sliver of our common history. Too often, history is written by the capitalist class. It's written by those that are fundamentally okay with a version of the status quo, right? Now, this book takes very real struggles of working people over a period of several years and really delves into the hard decisions that those folks had to make, the alliances that had to be built, and the discussions and debates that happened along the way, and the actions that resulted in positive change. We have shown one example. It's not exclusive. There is not one road to freedom and liberation, right? There are many paths to get to the common place we want to get to. But we showed concrete examples of how you could really make progress. Now, what I want to look back at is to say, I want to be able to look back and see how our modest contribution to that change in society helped other groups, such as BM in Western Massachusetts, in Portland, Maine, in Seattle, Washington, in Montana, in Colorado, wherever they may be. I want to be able to look back and see that in some small way we helped somebody think in a little different way outside the box to do something different that led to real victories for working people somewhere else. And I think we're still building that model through United in Vermont, and we're still in the fight every day. So frankly, the book, even though it's on the bookshelves now, and you could get it through pmpress.org if you go to their website, it's really an unfinished story. It's the first chapter in a movement of change. So, and I want to see other people write that book too. I want to see how the California AFL-CIO changes. I want to see how they really grow power out there. I want to see the South, workers in the South in the United States, in Texas and Alabama and Florida, how they're going to rise up and change the game and change what's politically possible in their states. And I want to read their books. And that's what I look forward to doing in the near future.
So, David, I have two more questions. I'll just ask the first one, and then Rick can take the next one. So the first one is, you mentioned the South many times here, and there's formations going on, such as the Southern Workers Assembly, which is doing quite amazing work. They work with Black Workers Justice, the United Electric Workers in North Carolina, and they're supporting bona fide union campaigns, but also doing some of the things I think you mentioned, if I heard you correctly, organizing where there is no union, for example, in sectors. So if there's classified employees somewhere in a university system or municipal workers, that they do various types of clever and strategic organizing within those industries in a variety of different ways, either by sector, it could be by industry. And they're making some inroads on that. And then, in states like Wisconsin, which essentially in many ways now reflects a southern state in terms of labor law, some of these understandings are coming to the fore. It takes a little while because before Scott Walker and the capitalist class ushered in Act 10, which eviscerated all collective bargaining, in 2011, the state had collective bargaining for almost 60 years. So it's hard for folks to understand that they now live essentially in a southern state for all intents and purposes to many degrees. So many different kinds of organizing has to take place to advance and win. So you mentioned something similar that's going on in Vermont. Can you expand on that a bit?
Well, let's remember that, frankly, before the New Deal, before the major changes that went in the United States society in the 1930s, there was really no protections. Everything was less than a right to work state. There was Pinkertons being brought out with axe handles, attacking union folks or proto-union folks, working people, when they demanded better conditions on the job. And in many cases, those working folks fought back with their own axe handles. And that was a century-long battle to get to the point where we could even have something called a legal labor movement and a legal right to strike, which is under threat all over the country, but in the US. So it's not like we haven't faced these challenges before. And people forget the fear that they had with the working class in the 1930s. And so then they start chipping away at these labor laws because the capitalist parties have still retained control over most political offices in the state. Although in Vermont, we have a third party, Social Democratic Progressive Party. But we faced this before and we've won. And if you look about the militant labor organizing going on right now today in countries like Colombia, in South America, Central America, these are places where labor leaders risk being assassinated on a regular basis, and yet they still organize, and they organize well, and they fight back, and they understand what's at stake, and they understand that it's class war, and that's what they're engaged in, and that's what we're engaged in. So we've had hard times before, and we've had times where we didn't have legal rights before, and we still managed to win. Where there is will, where there is collective will and solidarity, we can win. And these alternative models, or what is now called alternative models of organizing, be it in sectors, be it outside of formal union structure, I mean, these are part and parcel of working people do everywhere around the globe and have always done. What matters is what wins. And do those wins amount in aggregate to a movement of change? And if the answer is yes on both those fronts, they need to be supported. It doesn't just have to be non-unionized folks engaged in these things. The unions could lend their hand too. I mean, here in Vermont, we work in very close solidarity, or we provide solidarity and look as an ally, Migrant Justice, which is an organization of migrant farm workers that do not have legal status for the most part in the United States, that are winning, and they are changing working conditions for the better on our dairy farms. And they have won major victories on our dairy farms by acting collectively. They're not recognized as a labor union, though they're doing the same work as a labor union. And frankly, we've marched on their picket lines with them. We've gone to their demonstrations, and they've come to ours. So there can't be silos. There can't just be organized labor and the rest of the workers. We need to figure out things, actions, strategies, plans that work. And then we need to coordinate together, because it's only together that we're going to have the power. We're not going to compete with money. We're not going to compete with traditional notions of lobbying. We are going to win, not just compete, but win and defeat our enemies when we act collectively as one working class.
Okay, David, you started to touch on the question I was going to throw at you next, but I'm still going to throw it at you regardless, because I still am curious, and just in case there might be a different answer. There's been a lot happening in the labor movement, and it's been a while since, you've been on the show. We've seen the Teamsters throw down with UPS since then. We've seen the UAW throw down with the Big Three since then. And so my question to you is, what's inspiring you right now? What's really driving you? And that could be either a strike that's taken place or might take place. It could be an organizing activity. It can be a political idea. It could be a strategy, a strategical idea for labor right now. But my question is, what is inspiring you right now?
I thought that the UAW, under Shawn Fain's leadership, their stand-up strikes and escalating every week, growing the largeness of their strike and shutting new factories, was both innovative and effective. When you're engaged in that kind of fight with the capitalist owners, I like to telegraph what our next move is going to do, and that's what Shawn Fain did. He basically stood there with his leadership and with the rank and file behind him, and said, "Listen, if you don't come to the table and agree to this, then this is what we're going to do." And we're telling you right now, every week we're going to expand this, and we're going to roll it out until they're all shut down if need be. So you could wait until they're all shut down. You could wait for that, or you could agree to our demands now. And the major gains that they got out of that stand-up strike were historic. Now, what I want to see is the Southern campaign that they're engaged in right now with organizing new factories in the South in states that are traditionally very anti-union. Now that's going to be a game changer. If we see some big changes down there and we start seeing union density grow in the auto industry in the South, that will signal to me that this is not just a short-term boost of energy for the labor movement, but this is potentially a fundamental change in the power dynamics in the U.S.
Right on. Thank you so much for being on the show today, David. It's been a great pleasure having you back. Again, the name of the book is Insurgent Labor, the Vermont AFL-CIO from 2017 until 2023 by David Van Deusen. The preface is by Kim Kelly, and the foreword is by Steve Early, which is also a big deal. That's pretty cool. And you can find that on pmpress.org. And we'll have more information on the description to this episode, so people can actually link to where they can purchase the book and all that jazz. So thank you, David, for being on the show again. Thank you, listeners, always for listening to the show. We hope you got a handful of lessons out of speaking with David today. We will talk to you again next week. We'll be back to the regular news and reports on Palestine. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
I'll let Eric, brother. Thank you.
Great talking to you, David. Bye-bye.